Right. So as I said, Revelation 12, let's go look at that real quick and then we'll start going through the outline. Unless somebody has any questions or comments about Revelation 12 or anything at all. Everybody knows everything. That's great. So yeah, Alicia.
Uh, what outline?
Yeah, so we're on the outline that says Revelation 12, the woman, the child, and the
Oh,
dragon. That's the one.
okay,
Yep.
okay.
All right. So I'm just going to read the first couple of verses, and then we'll start going through this. We want to figure out what the major symbols are and what the time frame is when this is talking about. So those are the two most important things that we want to do. Verse 1, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. So we'll talk about the woman in just a minute. So let's see what happens with the woman. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Okay. Now, the dragon is identified for us in the next verse, I think. And we'll look at that. Um, Actually, it's a couple of verses on, but we'll read verse 7 through 9 now. War arose in heaven, Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So the dragon is the devil. The dragon is Satan, which means accuser. And he is the ancient serpent, the deceiver, all of the things he's called there. Who's the woman? And for the woman, we look at how she's first introduced and how she's clothed. And she is clothed with the sun. She has the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. And she's pregnant, about to give birth. And when she gives birth, she's going to give birth in verse 5 to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. And so we want to find out what's going on here. For the woman, I think if we go back to Genesis 37 and look at one of Joseph's dreams, we'll be aided greatly by this. Genesis 37, verse 9. Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me. But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, what is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. The image of the sun, moon, and stars that we see with the woman comes from this passage here, Joseph's dream, and where the sun, moon, and stars clearly refer to the family of Jacob, his wife, and his 12 sons. The reason there's 11 stars here instead of 12 is because Joseph himself is a star. He's a 12th star. So he's got his 11 brothers in the dream. They're bowing down to him. And in the dream, they're bowing down to him because it's a prediction of what's going to happen in Egypt when they come and bow down to him and to get food. But the image itself is of the family of God or the people of God there. which is, at the very beginning here in a seed form, right? It has not developed into the nation of Israel at this point, but it is still God's chosen people, from whom that is the line of the Messiah. That's through whom the Messiah will come. So when we get to Revelation 12, and we see the same imagery, and this woman is clothed this way, the interpretation would be, or the understanding would be, that this is the Old Testament people of God. This is the people of God. And the people of God are travailing and in birth, which is an image in the Bible for the pain and pressures and trials and troubles right before God brings about a new thing, bringing about a new thing. So the people of God are in travail, and they're about to give birth. And who are they going to give birth to, or what are they going to give birth to? And they're going to give birth to a male child who will rule the nations with a rod of iron. And if we go to Psalm 2 and look at that, and you'll remember from one of our earlier studies that Psalm 2 shows up in the book of Revelation about 17 times. It's a major background for the book of Revelation. And it is about the ascension and the rulership, the session of Christ on the throne. And in particular, we're looking at verse 9. It says, speaking about the Father, speaking about the Son, you shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. The rod of iron, the idea of being over the nations. And in this Psalm 2, the word is break. You'll break them. In the Revelation, it's you will rule them. Go ahead, Mom.
I'm struck when I read this about the difference between the picture of Jesus ruling with a rod of iron over the nations and the way that I experience his rule over my life, which is not a rod of iron, but which is gentle.
Right.
Such a difference.
Yeah, and actually that difference comes out actually in the Revelation passage, because it's using the word rule instead of break. It says you will rule over the nation, or he will rule over the nations with a rod of iron. But the word for rule there is the word for shepherd. And so that recalls the Micah passage, one of Ancient of Days, who will shepherd my people Israel, born in Bethlehem. And so we have this shepherding image combined with this image from Psalm 2. And Psalm 2 is the dominant image in the Revelation passage, as Psalm 2 is also dominant in the book of Revelation itself. So Jesus is, the picture clearly is the people of God. When we read Revelation 12, the people of God are travailing, about to give birth. So the Messiah, it's the times leading up right to the advent or the enthronement of the Messiah, because the Psalm 2 reference is not about Jesus being born, but about the Messianic kingdom beginning on his exaltation. And so the Messianic kingdom is about to begin, and what's happening is the dragon wants to prevent that. Right? The devil wants to prevent that. We know the story. And the devil does everything he can to try to prevent that. And when you look through the Old Testament and you see the attacks of the devil on the people of God, and you see the people of God's lack of faith and they're following idols, this is part of this is the background of this is the spiritual warfare with the devil trying to destroy the woman so that she can't give birth to the child. But he's unsuccessful, and that's what it says in Revelation. He's unsuccessful in doing that. The child is born, and then he tries to destroy the child. And we see that throughout Jesus's ministry. And he's again unsuccessful. The devil is again unsuccessful. Then at the end of the vision, which we didn't read this morning, but at the end of the vision, the dragon goes off to make war against the other children of the woman, because he's already been unsuccessful in trying to destroy the woman. He's not destroyed the Messiah, and now he's like taking, maybe the consolation prize is he can destroy the other children. Well, that would be us, And he's not successful. He's not going to be successful with that either. And this is part of the encouragement of the passage. It's an explanation for the people in the first century. Why is this persecution happening? Why, what is it that you've done that has put you on the outs with all of society, and now you're on the hit list with society? How come it's like that? Well, it's like that because this goes all the way back to Genesis 3, where God said there's going to be enmity between your seed, hostility between your seed, Eve, Jesus, and the seed of the serpent. It's the serpent and his seed. This picture now, for this prophecy from Genesis 3, is now being repeated again in the Revelation passage, and saying to the Christians, they treated Jesus like this. The church has been treated like this all along, and they treated Jesus like this, and you also will be treated like this. But just as God protected the church in the wilderness so that they could bring forth the Messiah, and just as God protected his son, God will protect you. And so this is kind of a historical review for them, looking kind of like behind the curtain, what's really going on. It's not really the hostile Jews, and it's not really the Roman Empire. It's the dragon. And it's the dragon is trying. This is why the battle is spiritual, right? Spiritual warfare. So anyway, just with those two passages, we set it in what are the major images here, what's going on, and what's the time frame. And the time frame is important because this passage has been interpreted by some to refer to a time in our future, or the fall of Satan way in the past, but it's clearly about the bringing forth of the Messianic kingdom, which happens with the ascension of Christ. And it's also an explanation for the persecution of the church in the first century. So that sets up that helps us orient ourselves, I think, as to what's going on in the passage. So
we're saying that the woman is who?
that would be, so different people say it different ways. The way some people have said it is that this is Israel, and that's a confusing term because you think of, a particular nation in a particular place, geopolitical organization, that kind of thing. This is the Old Testament people of God, or it is the people of God. It is the people of God that bring forth the Messiah. So I would say it like that. It's the people of God. And the woman is not just an Old Testament image, right? Because the woman goes on in the passage to say that the woman flees into the wilderness and she's protected by God. And so the woman then is the image of the people of God. There's continuity. So the people of God in the Old Testament, the people of God in the New Testament. But for the purpose of the image of giving birth, that's a past event for the people who are reading or hearing the revelation. The past event was the establishment of the kingdom in the ascension, resurrection, ascension, and session of Christ. So,
And what do we think about this symbolic period of time where God prepared a place for her to be nourished for 1,260 days?
yeah, so I have no conclusion on that. I can tell you what I've read. I am not confident in these things, but you might, after hearing them, think that they're so the woman flees into the wilderness to a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. And then later that's verse 6. And then later in the passage, verse 14, the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. So on the assumption that 1260 days is literal, and on the assumption that a time times and half a times is 3.5 years, then what you have is, and on the assumption that a month is to be 30 days long, then what you end up with is these are exact same amount of time. And so lots of different time frames have been suggested for this 1260 days, or this time times and half a time. They don't make sense to me in this particular context, but the time frames that are suggested are things like the persecutions of Nero started in 64. I don't remember what month. I think it was August, and ended in his death in June of 68, which was 42 months, 1260 days, or time times and half a time. The final siege of Jerusalem, the worst part of that, took exactly this period of time, which is it starts at a different date than the persecutions of Nero. It ends at a different date, but it's still the right amount of time. The ministry of Christ was approximately this long. I mean, you can just randomly pick, get out your timeline of New Testament history and just randomly pick things, but
yeah, there are a lot of things that you could compare it to, but they don't necessarily make any sense when put into this context.
Yeah.
So this is referring to the time of Jesus' ministry. Well, I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't, because it happened. The persecution of the chasing of the woman into the wilderness happens after the ascension, in the image. And so, yeah. So what do I personally make of the 1260 days? I don't know what it means. I have a general suspicion that, like most numbers that I've noticed in apocalyptic literature, that it doesn't have a literal. You're not supposed to actually count it.
Yeah. Well, I'm completely on board.
Yeah. So
with that.
So what I think it means then, taking that, I think it symbolizes, and I'm not completely happy with this explanation that I'm going to give, but it's a short period of time. So a time of limited duration in which the church endures persecution brought about by the attacks of the devil, and in which the church is protected by God from being destroyed during that period of time. And the woman is in the wilderness, another image, right? The wilderness. So basically, I haven't added anything to what it already says. I've just reduced the number down to a short period of time instead of saying specifically what it might refer to. And as I said, I'm not completely 100% happy with that explanation, but I'm less happy with the other ones that I've read. So, yeah, Becky. Oh, you're on mute.
So what I find interesting, and I'm not adding any knowledge, is that in Revelation 11, it calls out 1260 days for the two witnesses.
Mm-hmm.
So you have two chapters in a row that are calling out the same number of days, and both will be protected for that number of days before the protection is removed or they become vulnerable again.
Right. And, so you have the two approaches to the numbers, right? They're obviously, well, not obviously, but they seem to not be the same period. The witnesses are witnessing right prior to attack on Jerusalem. But these 1260 days, I mean, it could be it's after the ascension and before the destruction of Jerusalem, probably. But I'm not sure you could say within that 40-year period that it's identical, that they're identical. So so there's two ways people take them. They take them literally and they try to find the time period, or they take them it's not really a figure of speech, or they take them symbolically and do something something along the lines that what I just did. I think one day I'll understand that. I don't understand that right now. I think the thing I do understand in there, or have some understanding on, is the wilderness, which I think is an interesting thing. So in the Bible, the wilderness that's where Jesus went to be tempted. That's where the Israelites went. They fled into the wilderness. God took them there, opened the Red Sea, and sent them in there into the wilderness. And then he brought them out of the wilderness later into Canaan, which is a picture of the promised land. And so the wilderness is this place between Egypt and the promised land, right? It's between the kingdom of sin and darkness and the promised land. And so it's now for us. We're in the wilderness. When you read the book of Hebrews, he's always comparing modern Christians, at least first century Christians, to the wilderness generation that came out of Egypt. He's saying, you guys are the church in the wilderness, because they're not in the kingdom of sin and they're not in the promised land. They're in this transition area. Now, what is the wilderness? What's significant about the wilderness is that you leave behind everything else. You flee, right? You go into the wilderness, you're brought into the wilderness, and you have nothing. So they go and they have nothing, and God takes care of them. I think about the Israelites, right? So they plundered the Egyptians, but they can't eat gold. So they have gold and jewelry, and doesn't do anything except helps them build a golden calf. But they leave Egypt, they go into the wilderness experience, and basically everything that they used to rely upon for their sustenance is gone. I used to be able to work and I would get some ration of food. I used to, be able to go down to the market, buy something. I used to have a house with a bed where I could be sure I could go there and be safe and get a good night's sleep. None of this, everything has changed now. They're in the wilderness, none of that's there. And they have to rely on God exclusively for their protection and their provision and their direction and, their very life. And it becomes a time of testing for them, because the testing comes when you long for the thing that you left, and you want the thing that you left, and you prefer it over what God is giving you. And we see this repeatedly in the wilderness experience. And the Israelites, they don't do really well with their testing. And this is why we have then the testing of Jesus. So he does what Israel failed to do. He succeeds everywhere where they failed. And he says, I'm going to trust my Father. I'm going to trust my Father.
Well, another thing comes to my mind concerning the wilderness, and in Revelation 12 is I think the case could be made that this is referring to a period of time leading up to the fall of Jerusalem, where the prophets told the people, flee the city, go out, leave the city, and go into, presumably, the wilderness.
Yeah, leave Judea, leave the city, right? Yeah, it could be applied to that. I think in general, though, it's more talking about the place of God's people in the world. And the place of God's people in the world is, this world's not your home. You're in a transition right now. You're in the wilderness where it's sparse and it's threatening, and you have nothing to rely on but God. You can rely on yourself, but that'll be bad. So you can really try to, you have to learn to rely on God. And so in the picture in Revelation 12, God sends the woman into the wilderness. He doesn't take her out of the world. This is not a rapture. He doesn't take her out of the world. He takes her out of the city. Right? He takes her out of not Jerusalem or anything, but of the world city. He takes her out of the city of darkness, takes her out of Egypt, puts her in the wilderness. He hasn't brought her to heaven yet. And he says, I'm going to take care of you, and you're going to learn to trust me here in this wilderness. And you're going to see that whatever comforts you had in the city are inferior to the comfort I give. And whatever you could have gained there is loss. It's just dung compared to what you would gain with me. So the Father brings the church into the wilderness to sustain and nourish and teach and develop a relationship, basically. So it's actually a really interesting, it's a really helpful picture, I think, to think about the wilderness as between Egypt and the Promised Land. You see, the Egyptians, the armies that tried to pursue them, they all died, but the rest of the Egyptians, they were unaffected. They stayed at home and they stayed in the city, stayed in the country, stayed in Egypt. And God's people go into the place where God takes care of them exclusively, so they don't have the government taking care of them. Yes, Mom?
I think that there's a very strong case that can be made for this being symbolic, not literal, because there are so many examples in the Bible. I mean, more than what we've talked about. What Ishmael's mother, what was her name?
Yeah,
she was sent into the
Hagar.
wilderness. Hagar. She was sent into the wilderness, and she was protected by God.
Yeah.
He took care of her. When Jesus was a baby, they were sent back to Egypt, where God protected him. There's so many examples in the Bible of God sending the people into the wilderness and then protecting them, that why should this be a particular thing?
Right. Exactly. Yeah, you also have Elijah, right, fleeing from Jezebel. And he flees into the wilderness where he is comforted by God, and he hears the still small voice, and God recommissions him and strengthens him in the wilderness and provides for him, right? Yeah, it's a repeated image.
Well, the only thing different, though, in none of those cases is a period of time given, whereas here there is a period of time given.
Right. Yeah.
Now, I'm not trying to support a literal 1,260 days, but on the other hand, I think that does make it different than some of these other ones that Jane brought up.
Right. Yeah. And again, I guess the way I'm looking at it is analogous to the passage in Revelation 2, I think it is. Yeah, Revelation 2, it's the church at Smyrna. Verse 10, do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. I don't know anybody who thinks that's 10 days.
Literally, yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, for all we know, that might be 1,260 days.
Yeah, it's a short time.
I got a question.
Yeah.
That's an aside, really. What do we know concerning the fall of Babylon to the Persians? The fall of the city of Babylon. Was this a relatively bloodless coup, or was there a great battle that took place?
Yeah, so
Um,
it's the fall of the city is recorded for us in Daniel 5, and it was completely bloodless.
That's what I was thinking. Yes, which would the thing that came to my mind is, well, if it was a real fierce battle, I wonder um, how many of God's people may have died in as a result of that battle. But yeah, it was basically a bloodless coup, so I don't suppose that any would have died from collateral damage of a battle.
No, yeah, the the fall of Babylon to the Persians, the Media Persians, was basically handing over the keys to the kingdom. The Belshazzar looked up, and there was the Medio-Persian army standing in his palace. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, that's a great story. You guys probably all know it. There was an aqueduct that went under the wall of the city, and they dammed it up, and then they walked down under the city wall. All showed up in the city.
I think there must have been some guards who were asleep or something. Surely they would have guards.
Well, yeah, I would imagine a large army moving through the aqueduct itself would have made a lot of noise, but I can picture it being covered by foliage, because it is a source of water, and so you're going to have trees growing up around it and bushes and things like that. I could see that they could be invisible, especially at night. But
yeah, the other is of course a cover of darkness, but it kind of makes you wonder. It sounds like Babylon, their army may have been for some reason not very strong, because possibly they felt that they were in a period of peace, as opposed to the Persian army that came in very strong.
Yeah, I think they had the same problem as one of the cities one of the letters in Revelation says to the church that they need to wake up and pay attention and all that. And the image there was that they were a city that was on a precipice, and they thought that they were invincible, but twice in their history they'd been overcome because the guards thought they were invisible, so they weren't really doing a good job. And I think in the same way in Babylon, they thought these walls are so thick and so tall, nobody will ever get in. The walls were like 40 feet thick, something like that. And yeah, well, they were right. Nobody got over the wall, and nobody broke the wall, but they went under the wall. So, yeah, so I don't think they were really expecting any kind of threat.
Yeah. And that I think that sort of speaks volumes about the general effectiveness of a wall, and how it'll slow people down, but it's not going to stop them.
Yeah. So let's look at, so I think we've gone through verse 1 through 6 already. The child, in verse 5, it says the child was caught up to God and to his throne. And I have the reference Daniel 7, which is the Son of Man coming with clouds of heaven into the Ancient of Days. This is not a direct reference, but it's the idea here is that the child being caught up to the throne is not, it is actually, I think, a picture of the ascension. It's just a reference to the ascension there, that Christ is ascended. He's protected by God and snatched out of the jaws of the devil, and ascends to heaven. And then this is then what turns the devil's wrath. So the next part is verse 7. I'll read that.
Concerning this, so I'm thinking about periods of time, and then in verse 1 and 2, maybe, of Revelation 12,
Mm-hmm.
that this is not referring to a specific period, a specific time in history. It is sort of a general time. And this is not like something that this occurred in a day or a certain week, but over a period of time.
Yeah, the travail takes place over a long period of time. It's pretty much the entire Old Testament history.
And then, of
And-
course, verse 5 would be many years after that.
Right. So now we're in New Testament time. However a person reads it, it's either the birth of Christ or 33 years later or 30 years later when he ascends. I think it's the ascension that's being talked about, but in either case, puts you in that time period. So, yeah, I think it's a easily understood picture, at least to me. I think it's clear. Verse 7, now war arose in heaven. Now, the timing here is important. The sun has just ascended, and now war arises in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But he was defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him.
So again, you said it's your understanding that verse 7 is referring to a time after the ascension.
Yes, verse 7 is referring to a time after the ascension. I think verse 4, where it talks about swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth, I think that's referring to the time before the ascension when many Jewish leaders apostatize. Just by the way it's placed in the passage.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see, continuing to read verse 10. So what we have is the action, Michael and the angels fighting against the devil and his angels, his army. And the devil is defeated, he's thrown down, and then he's given the names, who is this devil? The ancient serpent, the devil, Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, thrown down to earth. And the consequence of that, verse 10, and I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. Very similar to the now you've begun to reign from chapter 11. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them day and night before our God. And they've conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. So what I want to point out here is this paragraph, the main thing happening in the paragraph is the accuser, Satan, the deceiver, is thrown out of heaven. He loses his place. That's the language that's used. He has no place anymore in heaven. And the rejoicing and the command to rejoice is because the accuser of the brethren has been thrown down. Now, I'm not sure if you are aware of, if you've been taught on this or not, but in the Old Testament, we see the devil in God's throne room accusing people. You can think of Job. The devil shows up and accuses people before God's throne. And basically what he's doing is he's attacking the integrity and faithfulness of God, but he's doing it indirectly by saying, look at this lousy person that you chose. I'm going to make him sin, or look at the terrible sins he's committed. How can you accept him? That kind of a thing. But what this passage says is that that place that the devil had prior to the ascension of Christ, he no longer occupies that. He does not stand in heaven accusing people anymore. He's
been thrown down.
He's been tossed out. Yeah, Mom.
So if he's not there accusing people, then why do we need to have Jesus there defending us?
Well, it's yeah. So you're thinking of maybe the passage in First John where we have an advocate. If anyone sins, we have an advocate before the Father. So that passage, um, the direct answer to the question is just the very presence of the mediator in the throne room of God. The fact that the Father has accepted his work once for all is evidence and testifies on our behalf. And in the First John passage and all the other passages that it's linked to, there's never a mention. There's not any mention of the devil being the accuser, but our own sins.
Yes, that's exactly what was. I'm thinking it's our fallen nature that we need an advocate to.
Yeah, and so the First John passage reminds us that Jesus has finished the work, and he stands in heaven accepted by the Father as our representative, and there's no fault in him. And so, although you sin, God looks at Jesus and he sees, you are in Jesus. You are sinlessly forgiven. You're forgiven completely and accepted by the Father, even though you still sin. And that's John's point. He's saying if we have even if we sin, we have this advocate, this testimony, this before the Father. Remember that he's there before the Father. So the devil is
Hallelujah.
not. Yeah. So the devil's not standing there. This is basically the argument of the devil in the Old Testament goes like this. How can you accept Abraham? Look at that. He's a terrible sinner. You're totally unjust to take him. His sin hasn't been paid for. That's the argument. Well, that argument is totally void after the ascension. As soon as Christ is resurrected from the dead, that argument has the legs cut right out from under it. And now there's no argument.
God no longer has that gnat flying around his head.
Yeah. So
Buzz, buzz, buzz.
buzz, right. So, let's look at Zechariah. It's a great passage. Zechariah chapter 3. This will be the last passage we look at for today, I think. It's like we're almost out of time. Well, maybe we'll have time. Maybe we'll have time for more. We'll see. Zechariah 3. So we looked at this last week, or maybe the week before, about Zerubbabel, the governor, right? And now there's a vision here about Joshua, the high priest. And chapter 3.
I'm sorry. Can we?
Yeah.
What is the time period? Zerubbabel was a governor after the people were released from captivity in Babylon.
That is correct. So the people were released from captivity in about 539 by Cyrus, made a decree, 539, 538 BC. Some people went back to Jerusalem. Zechariah is a prophet in Jerusalem, and Zerubbabel.
He was never in Babylon.
I don't think he was. He may have been, but I'm not aware. Zerubbabel, who we read about before, was the governor of the exiles. So they're called the returned exiles, right? The post-exilic community coming into Jerusalem. And Joshua is the high priest. And the time period for this is about 520. It's actually not about 520. It's 520 BC. Some of these are dated, but all of the prophecies in Zechariah take place within about 3 months in 520 BC. So they're same time as the prophet Haggai.
That's true of a lot of this, I think. Concerning the prophets of that time, their writings were covered a relatively short period of time.
Right. Yeah, and there were often more than one prophet active at the same time. Yeah. So, and Zechariah and Haggai are not only active at the same time, but they're actually in the same place. They're actually both in Jerusalem. So it's undoubtedly they knew each other, and
Yeah, and when we say they were in Jerusalem, we're probably talking about a city with not that many inhabitants.
yeah, not a lot of inhabitants, not a lot of walls at this point. We're prior to Ezra and Nehemiah. So let's look at the passage, chapter 3, verse 1. Then he showed me, this is the angel showing Zechariah. Then he showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan. The Lord who has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this a brand plucked from the fire?" Now Joshua was standing before the angel, that is the angel of the Lord, standing before the angel clothed with filthy garments. And the angel said to those who were standing before him, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to him he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." And I said, "Let them put a clean turban on his head." So they put a clean turban on his head and clothed him with garments, and the angel of the Lord was standing by. And the angel of the Lord solemnly assured Joshua, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, if you will walk in my ways and keep my charge, then you shall rule my house and have charge of my courts, and I will give you the right of access among those who are standing here. Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, you and your friends who sit before you, for they are men who are a sign. Behold, I will bring my servant the branch. For behold, on the stone that I have set before Joshua, on a single stone with 7 eyes, I will engrave its inscription, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day. In that day, declares the Lord of hosts, every one of you will invite his neighbor to come under his vine and under his fig tree. Under his vine, under his fig tree, that resting in God's provision.
So in this passage,
Yeah.
Zechariah is, he's really not a player in these passages, other than he's the one that is seeing these images, these visions.
I think,
and he's looking down, and there's the angel of the Lord, there is Satan, and there is Joshua, the high priest.
Except that's generally true, except in this one in verse 5, he actually contributes. It says, "And I said," meaning Zechariah, "put a clean turban on his head." That's pretty interesting. He gets to participate in his own vision. John gets to do that too. Go ahead and eat that scroll. And so John, gets to eat the scroll. Yeah, Mom.
And this really strikes me, verse 8. Listen, O high priest Joshua, because I'm reading from the NIV.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, O high priest Joshua, and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come.
Mm.
Wow, how clear is that?
Very clear.
And the New Revised Standard says, for they are an omen of things to come. Did you say omen, Jane, or men? You must have said omen.
They said, who are men symbolic of things to come.
So you did say men. Okay.
Yeah. So the interesting part of the passage, for our purpose of talking about Satan and his role as accuser, which is what Satan means, is that we see him here doing exactly what his name says he does. He's the accuser. He stands in the court and he accuses Joshua. And what's the purpose? Why can he accuse Joshua? Because Joshua is dressed in filthy rags. And what do the filthy rags symbolize? Well, his sin, his iniquity. Because the Lord says, take off those filthy rags. And then he says, I've taken away your iniquity, and then put on the new robes. I'm going to clothe you with new robes of righteousness. But the devil's accusation is, you've got no basis for that, right? He doesn't say it in the passage, but the obvious argument is, he's still a dirty sinner. You haven't really changed anything. you know. And so, but that changes, right? That the ascension, the acceptance of Christ's sacrifice once for all for his people completely changes that. And now the devil is not in the heavenly courtroom accusing God's people. He's not there accusing. So here we have the picture, right? So Abraham dies and goes to be with God. And Satan stands there and says, what are you doing? I don't get it. How does he get in? He's not righteous. Like, he lied about his wife so many times. He did this and that. He was, you know, and God says,
Where is that again?
what? No, I'm theologically, I'm giving a picture of what happened. I'm not quoting a passage.
Oh, okay.
So God could say, his sin will be forgiven in the future when my son comes, and the devil could respond to that. That's irrelevant for today. You know, that doesn't mean anything for right now. But and the devil would be completely wrong about it. But the fact is,
Well, it's sort of irrelevant.
Abraham's sin is only forgiven in a promise until Christ is resurrected.
Yeah, that's why it's irrelevant to me.
Yeah. So the devil, and when we read the Revelation 12 passage, we see the vision starts out in heaven with the woman in heaven, the devil in heaven, the dragon in heaven. And then the woman gives birth to a child who is then brought up to heaven. So there's the heavenly church, right? And the earthly church, continuity between them. But the devil's thrown out of heaven and cannot accuse God's people in heaven anymore. Not us in heaven before the throne of God, and not those who are in heaven already. Can't accuse them before the Father. So, yeah, anyway.
Chapter 12 is so rich.
Yeah, there's such great stuff right here. And it's really a great chapter, if you're feeling depressed about, your own sin and all that, read Revelation 12 and go, well, I'm the only one condemning myself.
Hello.
Jesus is up there and he's my representative and he's been accepted, and the devil isn't up there condemning me. What a fool am I, to condemn myself. So great stuff there. Great chapter. And I think we're at 10:31, so it doesn't look like we're going to be able to finish it. But let's see if I sufficiently. Yeah. So
we haven't directly
we haven't directly referred to many of the passages on the outline, but we've covered.
On page 2. I mean, also the summary of the vision.
Yeah, we haven't talked about that, although I did kind of summarize it. So, all right, we'll stop here today and pick up verse 10 or 11. On Tuesday, I'll get another outline ready for chapter 13, in which we get to be introduced to the beast from the sea and the beast from the land, and we might as well just include the whore of Babylon, and just put all the bad guys together and see what we come up with. So we already have the main bad guy, the dragon, and now we're going to have the other bad guys showing up in the rest of the book.
And as an aside, an FYI, I finally got the blood test that the doctor put an order in